morning, everyone. Welcome to Grand Rounds and a big welcome to Dr. Joanna Cohen. Dr. Cohen obtained her PhD in Health Policy and Administration from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and her Master's of Health Science degree in Community Health and Epidemiology from the University of Toronto. She's currently the Bloomberg Professor of Disease Prevention and the Director of the Institute for Global Tobacco Control at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. She also holds an appointment in the Dalla Luna School of Public Health at the University of Toronto. She's been involved in tobacco policy research for over 25 years. She trained in epidemiology and health policy, and her research interests focus on the factors that affect the adoption and implementation of public health policies and on evaluating the beneficial effects and the unintended consequences of such policies. She's worked on the studies of both US and Canadian legislators regarding tobacco and tobacco control policy, a longitudinal cohort of smokers focusing on factors influencing quitting behavior. She's the deputy editor of the Journal of Tobacco Control and was recently a voting member of the US Food and Drug Administration's Tobacco Product Scientific Advisory Committee. A very warm welcome to Dr. Cohen.
Thanks so much, Dr. Levin. It's a pleasure to be with you this morning. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. All right, that looks good. Let me get the people away. Just one second, and then. All right, here we go. So I'm going to be talking about e-cigarettes. I just want to say before I start that cigarette smoking is still the major killer in this country and around the world. Unfortunately, it's sort of old news because it's been around for a while. And the good news is that prevalence of cigarette smoking is declining in this country, particularly among kids, which is fantastic. But it's still the major killer. However, lots of people want to talk about e-cigarettes. I'm going to be speaking about e-cigarettes this morning. So I'll try and keep my comments to about 40 minutes so we have plenty of time for Q&A. All right, so I'll just start with my disclosures. I have no funding from any private companies. My current and past funding, including honoraria and travel reimbursements, are from Bloomberg Philanthropies, NIH, Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, and various federal, state, provincial governments and government agencies and academic institutions, as well as a couple of others here. All right, so let me jump in. I mean, everyone's heard about e-cigarettes, and in the end of 2018, the Surgeon General at the time named e-cigarette use among kids as an epidemic. We also, towards the end of 2019, had the EVALI outbreak, which I'll speak to briefly shortly, which was extremely scary, ended up being many more deaths. So e-cigarettes were in the news at that point. And of course, with COVID, there's been a lot of interest in whether and how cigarette smoking as well as e-cigarette use might affect susceptibility to coronavirus infection, as well as severity of disease. So in the news, what I want to sort of focus on today is whether e-cigarettes can be an effective health promotion strategy. So what I'll do is I'll just say a few words about e-cigarettes, just describe them. I'll touch on EVALI. I'll focus, or I won't focus, but I'll say something about how the FDA is regulating e-cigarettes. It's quite an interesting story. And then I'll talk briefly about what we know about the health effects from e-cigarettes, what we know about e-cigarettes and smoking cessation, what we're actually seeing in practice, and then a summary. So I'll just keep moving through this. So the first most important thing to remember is that e-cigarettes are a very heterogeneous class of products. Now, a cigarette is a cigarette. There's, the packaging is different. The companies try to appeal to different groups in the population through the packaging and the advertising, but a cigarette's a cigarette. E-cigarettes are very different in their design, and because of that, in their effects. So we started off with these, what we called cig-alikes, e-cigarettes, which sort of looked like cigarettes. And then we had these like vape pens. We have the tank systems that have a lot of user settings, and people can replace the coils and change various characteristics. And then, of course, sort of the Juul pod and subsequent takeoffs on Juul. So, and these are just some of the types of e-cigarettes and what they look like. So in general, an e-cigarette it's a device that has a battery that heats a heating element to turn a nicotine liquid into an aerosol. So that's basically what it does. So there's a liquid inside with nicotine, you heat it up, there's an aerosol, and the nicotine is in a solution of propylene glycol and vegetable glycerin and various combinations of those. And depending on those combinations, you may have more or less aerosol being produced. And there's often flavorants as well. Okay, so these products are also called by many different names: e-cigarettes, cigalikes, e-hookahs, mods, vape pens, vapes, tank systems. Once the brand Juul became popular, we just had a whole range of words about Juul and Juuling, and that just became this terminology that was pretty common among kids and in the media. And then technically we call these electronic nicotine delivery systems. So all kinds of words. I'll just tell you, as someone in this field, I don't like the word vaping because it implies that it's a vapor that's produced, and a vapor is generally like a water vapor, but this is what's produced as an aerosol that's not a water vapor. There are various things in this aerosol, harmful chemicals. So try not to use the word vaping, although I use it when I'm talking to the media or general public. That's what people know. And in our surveys, we ask about vaping, but to an academic audience, I try not to use that terminology. One of the things is that at the very beginning of sort of e-cigarettes coming onto the market, there were a lot of small independent companies, and a number of them were really sort of anti-cigarette and saying, we would like the end of the cigarette industry, the end of cigarettes. This is a better product. You can get your nicotine, but none of the serious health effects. So that was in the early days. Today, all the major tobacco companies are in the game with brands. So, Philip Morris, Altria, Japan, so all of these British American Tobacco, Reynolds, they all own major e-cigarette brands. So it has changed since the early days. Let me say a few words about EVALI. It's an acronym for a pretty long sort of phrase, which is e-cigarette or vaping product use associated lung injury. So EVALI is much easier to say. So let's see. Okay, so this is sort of a time series from January 2017 through January 2020, showing emergency department visits that had e-cigarettes as the reason for the visit. And so there were cases even as early as January 2017, but what we saw was a huge peak in September 2019. And so no one understood, no one knew what was causing this. This is a little more complex. It also shows emergency department visits, but it's broken down by age group. And the top line in red is the age group with the highest number of cases, and that was the age group 10 to 19 years old. And the second highest number of visits was in the group 20 to 29 years old. And the third highest age group with emergency department visits from e-cigarettes was 30 to 39 years old. So this was like young people. It was usually males, and extremely scary because some people got extremely sick and died, and they're young, healthy people. So really terrifying. What eventually did we find out? So the CDC, the FDA is doing their investigations. So by January 2020, so a few months later, there were some findings from their investigation. And basically, they found that 82% of the patients hospitalized for EVALI reported using THC containing products. And vitamin E acetate seemed to be in these liquids. It was an additive to these THC containing products. And it seems like this vitamin E acetate, which, turns out it's not, like a number of things, not very good to inhale, was causing this severe lung injury. And in the end, so by February 18th, 2020, there were over 2,800 hospitalizations from EVALI and 68 deaths. But once the source of, or the, that it was identified that it was vitamin E acetate and these THC compound products, the cases just went down. So news got out, and it seemed to be that these products were obtained from more informal sources, and they were able to, shut that down. So I haven't heard, like, there haven't been more cases of EVALI, at least nothing at epidemic proportions. And the question is, I mean, it's unclear if the vitamin E acetate was responsible for all of the cases, but certainly a high proportion. So that's EVALI. So all of these things with the youth vaping, e-cigarette use epidemic, youth using these products in droves, and then this scary EVALI with young, healthy people getting sick and dying. All this, there was a public outcry, and a number of states implemented either bans on the sale of e-cigarettes, or at least bans on flavored e-cigarettes. So there was a lot of sort of states and localities trying to do something to reduce use and respond to these issues. So let me just say, talk for a few minutes about how the FDA is regulating tobacco, well, specifically e-cigarettes. So with the Tobacco Products Act, or the Tobacco Control Act for short, that was signed into law in 2009. That act created a new center of the FDA, and it was the Center for Tobacco Products. It was financed by user fees on tobacco companies. So the tobacco companies had to pay, and the money went to do all the work of the Center for Tobacco Products. And so of course, tobacco products, and particularly cigarettes at the time, are extremely harmful and deadly, right? Cigarettes killing 1 in every 2 long-term users. So you can't use the same sort of safe and effective standard as the FDA uses for pharmaceutical products. That doesn't work because cigarettes are not safe and effective. So they created what they called a public health standard. And basically, this says that when the FDA is considering regulations on these products, they have to consider the risks and the benefits of the product to the population as a whole. So both the users of the products and non-users or potential users, like kids who don't smoke yet, for example, or cigarette smokers who've quit and may be at risk of relapse. So you've got to consider the whole population, not just the person who's using the product, which is different, obviously, than how we regulate pharmaceutical products. And so, it's just this public health standard looking at the population as a whole. Okay. So let me just give you a bit of a timeline of what's happened. So in 2006, e-cigarettes were started to come onto the US market. And in March 2009, the FDA said, hey, these products, like, why would they be here? The only purpose would be as a smoking cessation device. So let's regulate e-cigarettes as a drug under CDER, the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, as just like NRT. That's how we should regulate them. Well, in June, things take time. So in June 2009, as I said, the Tobacco Control Act was signed into law, and it gave the FDA jurisdiction over cigarettes and smokeless tobacco. Those were the classes of tobacco products contained in the Tobacco Control Act. And later, the next year, in 2010, the DC Circuit ruled, so e-cigarettes companies actually sued and said that they didn't want their products regulated as drugs. And the DC Circuit agreed with them and said that the FDA must regulate e-cigarettes as tobacco products, so under the Center for Tobacco Products, rather than under CDER, like NRT or other pharmaceutical products. And of course, the Center for Tobacco Products is new. They don't have a track record. They're dealing with a product that isn't safe in the first place. So the whole sort of concept is very different. So the FDA had to regulate e-cigarettes as tobacco products, but that wasn't included in the act. So it took some time to basically what they call deem these products. And in May 2016, so this is, 6 years later from that DC court ruling, FDA asserts its authority over other tobacco products, including e-cigarettes. So starting 2016, they had the authority to regulate e-cigarettes. And what they said is e-cigarettes that are on the market as of August 2016 would need to file a new product application that would be approved by the FDA. They would review the application, and they would have to do that by August 2018. So they had 2 years to do that. Now, in July 2017, so of course there was an election, new folks in DC, and in July 2017, the FDA extended the deadline for filing these applications by 4 years. So companies now had until August 2022 to file these applications to be allowed to sell their product. So basically, it just extends the time that e-cigarettes are on the market with no effective regulation. There were a couple of policies put into place. So it was illegal to sell these products to minors. There was an addiction warning label and text required on the products, and they couldn't make any health claims. But there were no restrictions on the marketing of these products, on the flavors, etc. So the horse was out of the barn. These e-cigarettes are proliferating, all the different kinds, brands sold all over. And we have until August 2022 to, for them to keep selling until they had to file applications. Well, the health group sort of got involved and brought this case to the court and said 2022 is way too long. We've got a youth e-cigarette use epidemic. We had a valley, like we can't wait that long. So a judge rolled that back and said, okay, by May 2020, so 2 years earlier, you need to submit your application to market these products. Well, then COVID happened. And, everything sort of stopped. People are figuring out how to do their work, not from the office. And so the deadline was extended again to September 9th, 2020. So that deadline held. By September 9th, 2020, e-cigarette companies, anyone selling e-cigarettes or manufacturing, had to submit an application to continue to sell their product. And the FDA has 1 year to review the applications and make a determination. So the big question is, what is going to happen on September 9th, 2021, which is just around the corner? And we don't know. What we do know is that the FDA received tens of thousands of applications. So they're very busy going through them, and we'll see what changes, if anything, in a couple of months. So that's the regulation story. In terms of factors, so let me move to health effects of e-cigarettes. All right. Oh, there's a question. Was there an appeal on the 2010 DC circuit? So yeah, so basically I think I went through the timeline for these deadlines. And so now we're set. Those deadlines are set. Okay, so these products have not been around for very long, not like cigarettes, where we have over 50 years, 60 years, 70 years of research on cigarettes. These products have not been around for a long time. Plus, as I said, they're very, like, all the products are a bit different. So you know how science goes. You got to get the funding, you got to write the proposal to get the funding, and then do the work, and then eventually it's published. And that's a long time. And by then, the products on the market are different than the products that you are studying. So it's very difficult to keep up with this field and to be up to date on health effects. But in general, what has been found is that there are short-term, both cardiovascular and pulmonary health effects from e-cigarettes. So we see increased heart rate, increased blood pressure, increased arterial stiffness, and increased resistance to airflow in the lungs. So there are these shorter-term effects, even if you just look at the solution, the propylene glycol and the vegetable glycerin, which are named as generally approved as safe for ingestion, but not for inhalation. So even inhaling just the solvents seem to cause some of these issues. So the longer term health effects are still, we're still examining them. So overall, I would say, very early days in terms of knowing a lot about the health effects. There is work showing that there are heavy metals in the liquids and in the aerosol, possibly because of the coils degrading, and so heavy metals getting in, which can cause various problems. But it's still early days, and as I said, the products keep changing. So it is challenging. But what are some of the things that the health effects can depend on? So one of them is the device characteristics and the wattage of the device. Some of the devices are set wattage. Some of them you can adjust yourself to have different amounts of power. With higher power, you get higher temperature, and with higher temperature, you get more toxins. So device characteristics can play a role in the health effects. Also, the liquid characteristics can play a role. So there's the formulation of the nicotine. Up until Juul came on the market, all the nicotine liquids were sort of a nicotine base solution. And one of Juul's major innovations was they developed a nicotine salt liquid. The nicotine salt is a lower pH. The lower pH makes the aerosol easier to inhale. And because it's easier to inhale, because nicotine is aversive to inhale. So with the salt, easier to inhale, you can inhale, they can put more nicotine in the salt and people can inhale it and not get the aversive reaction. So Juul, which was what the kids were using, partly, I don't think they were using it necessarily because of the salt, but because of the marketing, and it's so sleek. I have one with me and I can show you after. It's just gorgeous looking and very attractive, and you can hide it very easily. So the kids were using these Juuls, which had really high nicotine concentrations because of the salt, and they were getting addicted very quickly. So you have the formulation, which is it a salt? Is it a base that can play a role? The nicotine concentration. So within those, how much nicotine do you have? There are the flavor chemicals that are in the solution. And as I mentioned, the solvent. So all of those can have impacts on the health effects. And then of course, the user behavior. Just like with cigarettes, how much are you puffing, how frequently, how deeply are you inhaling, et cetera. So all those can have impacts on the health effects as well. And just to let you know, for adult users who are regular e-cigarette users, many of them actually use multiple kinds of devices and liquids. So they mix and match and use different ones at different times of the day. So it's not just that they're using one device. It's very difficult to do some of these studies and really understand what's going on and what is causing what. So that's the health effects. I'm sorry, I don't have tons of specific information. I'll just say, I guess, also in general. So the studies that have been done overall find that e-cigarettes have fewer toxicants than cigarettes, which is not surprising because cigarettes are completely awful. There's combustion, over 4,000, chemicals coming out, lots of carcinogens. So you can't get any worse than a cigarette, right? So they're not as bad as a cigarette, but we're still finding toxicants in the aerosol and that there are short-term health effects that have been documented. So that's basically where we are now. So the whole point of e-cigarettes is theoretically that they can help cigarette smokers get off cigarettes. So what do we know about that? Do e-cigarettes help people quit smoking? So there was a report that came out from the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine on the public health consequences of e-cigarettes that was released in January 2018. So in the world of e-cigarettes, that's pretty old now. But what they found based on the evidence at the time, and I'll just read the main conclusion. So they said there is insufficient evidence from randomized control trials about the effectiveness of e-cigarettes as cessation aids compared to no treatment or to FDA-approved smoking cessation treatments, things like NRT and bupropion and those sorts, and some of the pharmaceutical products. While the overall evidence from observational studies is mixed, there is moderate evidence from observational studies that more frequent use of e-cigarettes is associated with increased likelihood of smoking cessation. So one of the things that was found is that people, because these are completely unregulated products, so they don't have a pharmacist or a doctor, there are no guidelines on using, clinical guidelines. So no one's really advising cigarette smokers on how to use the product. So first of all, if people aren't using the product enough, sort of like NRT as well, if you're not using enough of it and you're not getting the nicotine that your brain is craving, it's not going to be effective. So what the study went, this last part of the conclusion, what they found is that people who are using the products regularly with enough nicotine delivery, they do better at smoking cessation, which makes sense because they're trying to replace the nicotine from cigarettes. So then there was, one of the sort of trials that has gotten the most attention was published in New England Journal of Medicine about a year later in February, it was actually Valentine's Day, February 2019. And this was from the UK. And it was a randomized trial. They put e-cigarettes head to head with nicotine replacement therapy. So the participants were dependent smokers who were seeking help to quit. So they wanted to quit smoking. The treatment, so whether they were using e-cigarettes or NRT, they also received behavioral support for at least 4 weeks. So right there, that's not usually what someone would do, in practice. This is part of a trial. So you have to remember that they were getting behavioral support, which is really important for smoking cessation. So what did they find? At 1 year, 18% of the e-cigarette group had stopped using cigarettes, or they had been abstinent from cigarettes for a whole year. And it was 10% for the NRT group. So the e-cigarettes did better than NRT. However, it's only 18%, less than 1 in 5 people who used e-cigarettes were able to get off cigarettes for 1 year. And the other thing to note that at 1 year follow-up, 80% of the e-cigarette group were still using e-cigarettes. So this is problematic. And so our challenge really in the health field is to get a product that is attractive to cigarette smokers and appealing and gives them the nicotine that they need. It's not going to be attractive or at least available to kids or non-cigarette smokers. And it's a product that will get them off the cigarettes, but then you want to get them off of the e-cigarettes and not continue, right? Because they're still not safe. These products are still not safe. So we still have a lot of work to do to get to the ideal, to get to a product that's going to meet all of the sort of, health requirements. The Surgeon General came out with a report on smoking cessation not that long ago. And they found that, let me just, sorry, just going ahead here. So this was, sorry, I've got my chat copy. So in January 2020, let me just, I see there's something in the chat. If anything, e-cigarettes promote nicotine dependence. Yeah, so, right. So we can talk about nicotine dependence of e-cigarettes. I mean, part of NRT and the idea of nicotine replacement is you want to replace the nicotine from cigarettes to a safer product. And so it'll only work if you give them enough, if you give the brain enough nicotine. Type of NRT, well, you know what, I'm going to leave that for a moment. If we have time, we'll get back to that. So just a couple of conclusions from the Surgeon General's report from 2020. So about a year ago. So this is what I've said already. E-cigarettes are a continually changing and heterogeneous group of products that are used in a variety of ways. They're used to try to quit smoking, but they're also used recreationally. It is difficult to make generalizations about efficacy for cessation based on clinical trials involving any particular e-cigarette. So this goes back to the issue that these are heterogeneous products. So just, you're going to do a trial with a certain kind of e-cigarette. And so the conclusions are going to be based on that product, and it doesn't necessarily translate to other products, other e-cigarette products that people may use. And then they concluded that there's presently inadequate evidence to conclude that e-cigarettes in general increase smoking cessation. So it's just, it's tricky. It's hard to do these large studies. They take time, but the marketplace is evolving, and it's just a very challenging area to study. All right. Now, just like the health effects, like the health effects of e-cigarettes, their effectiveness as a smoking cessation aid will depend partly on the same sorts of things. So the device characteristics, how much power you have, how much aerosol you're producing, how much nicotine is in that. With higher power and higher temperatures, you get more nicotine in the aerosol. You also get those higher toxicants. So that's going to have an impact. The same thing with the liquid characteristics, whether it's a salt or a base liquid, the concentration, how much nicotine you're actually getting from the device. The flavors will help with the appeal of the product, et cetera. And then how the products are used, how frequently you're using them. So all of these factors and more are going to influence their effectiveness as a smoking cessation aid. All right, so I'm going to be wrapping up. So just what are we seeing in practice these days? So again, this is just going back to the trends of what started, what got the US Surgeon General to declare e-cigarette use among youth as an epidemic. So these are e-cigarette use among youth. The top line is high school students, the bottom line is middle school students. And the big scary time was from 2017 to 2018, where there was an increase in use, such that we had over 1 in 4 high school students reporting that they currently, this is to any tobacco product, sorry, that they currently used any tobacco product, but most of it was e-cigarettes. Because, as I said, great news, cigarette use is continuing to go down among youth. Okay, so this is, this shows on the left trends in cigarette use among youth, cigarettes among youth from 2011 to 2019. So it's going down. And on the right, it's e-cigarette use. So overall, cigarette use going down among youth, from 2011 and earlier. E-cigarette use, big increase from 2016, 2017 up to 2019, a huge jump in e-cigarette use at a much higher rate than cigarette use was declining. So some people have argued, potentially, like particularly tobacco companies, oh, well, the kids are using e-cigarettes and they're using them instead of cigarettes. So this is all good. We would much prefer them to use e-cigarettes than cigarettes. But the increase, you have to see, the increase in e-cigarette use is much steeper, much more intense than the decline in cigarette use. And that's, for the same period. Okay. This is another way of looking at what was happening during this time. I know there's a lot here, but the pink bars is the prevalence of youth e-cigarette use that we've seen. So from 2014 to 2019, in 2019, it was 27.5% using, like in the past month, using currently. And then the blue sort of line, the blue area is sales of e-cigarettes. So sales increase, youth use is increasing. And the orange area under the graph is Juul sales of Juul, which sort of went way up and mirrored the increase in youth e-cigarette prevalence. So, I mean, this isn't anything we didn't know, that kids were using Juul, Juul sales increase and youth use increases. Okay, and then if we look at this, a similar graph for adults. So we see the blue, the market sale of e-cigarettes. We see the orange, the market sales of Juul. And where is the adult use? Really low, all the way from 2014 to 2018. We're at like 3% currently using. So while e-cigarette sales and Juul sales went up, it did not increase among adults. Quite alarming. All right, we did have some good news in 2020 when we got the results of the 2020 National Youth Tobacco Survey. So we did see a decline in e-cigarette use among high school students and middle school students, partly maybe because of COVID. So hopefully, fingers crossed that those trends are going to continue. However, these prevalence rates are still pretty high. Like we're still at about 20% of high school students, using within the past month. So still high, but decline. So fingers crossed that that's going to continue. Okay, so just a couple of other things. I think I'm good for time. So just so you know, in addition to e-cigarettes, we now have other products, and one class of products is called heated tobacco products. Okay, so let me just say, where e-cigarettes heat a nicotine liquid, okay, they heat a nicotine liquid to produce an aerosol. Heated tobacco products heat tobacco to produce an aerosol that you inhale. Cigarettes burn tobacco to produce smoke. Okay, so that's sort of the difference. So it's heating tobacco to high temperatures without combustion. to give you supposedly a more satisfying tobacco taste and experience. So FDA actually permitted the sale of one particular heated tobacco product. It's called IQOS, and it's sold by Philip Morris, or manufactured by Philip Morris. And so this is from 2019 that the FDA permitted the sale of this product. So this is the only heated tobacco product that's permitted to be sold in the US currently. But IQOS and many other heated tobacco products from all the major tobacco companies are sold in other countries. Okay, so here's some of them. So you've got the IQOS, you've got Plume Tech, you've got Glow from the different companies. So they're all in this business. Sometimes people refer to these products as heat not burn. I don't like, it's sort of tobacco industry speak. I tend to not like that term because it implies that there isn't burning, and it makes it sound safer. So I don't like to use it. So we tend to say heated tobacco product. Okay. So the horse was out of the barn, and now we have many horses out of the barn with even not just the e-cigarettes, we've got the heated tobacco products. And now if you're, at the gas station, like I was just the other day, you might see ads for these new products, which we're tending to call nicotine pouches, sort of like smokeless tobacco, smokeless pouches. But again, the difference is it's not tobacco in the pouch, it's nicotine. Nicotine in the pouch. So it's the same difference, so it's a nicotine pouch, and you can see on the ad, it says tobacco-free nicotine pouches, and they come in all the flavors, etc. So this is going to be very tricky for the FDA and how we're going to regulate these products, because the FDA is allowed to regulate tobacco products. And if the nicotine is not derived from tobacco leaf, which these companies are saying that they're using synthesized nicotine rather than nicotine derived from tobacco leaf, then it's a real gray zone. So we will see what's happening. But again, all these new products, new flavors, etc. So there's a lot going on in the marketplace. Okay, so just to sum up, can e-cigarettes be an effective health promotion strategy? Well, National Academies, Surgeon General says not yet. But again, we have to keep in mind that these are very heterogeneous products, and some device and liquid characteristics and combinations are likely more effective for smoking cessation than others. The key thing that I like to keep in mind is that e-cigarettes, heated tobacco products, ideally should be an exit ramp for cigarette smokers. It should be a way to get cigarette smokers off cigarettes, and that would be the only reason to have them around. However, what we've seen, unfortunately, is that these products have become an on-ramp to nicotine addiction for youth, and many adults tend to use e-cigarettes and continue to smoke their cigarettes. We call that dual use. So they're continuing to use both products, which doesn't provide any health benefits to them. So what I would say is, at this time, no one should be using e-cigarettes or heated tobacco products except for people who are really trying to quit smoking cigarettes, and other things have not worked for them. Now, the FDA's public health standard that I talked about should not allow for an alternative to cigarettes for adult smokers to come at the expense of a new generation of youth who are addicted to nicotine. But we're going to have to wait and see for September of this year to see what decisions the FDA makes about all these e-cigarette product applications. So, we will see what happens. Who knows what the implications are of e-cigarettes for the future of health and for the future of tobacco use. We have a lot of sort of catch up to do, and it's going to be really hard to bring the horses back into the barn now that they've been running around, all these e-cigarettes on the market for so many years. It's really hard to reverse that. So we sort of took the wrong step forward, I think. You can't put the genie back in the bottle. So it's hard to know, but hopefully where we'll get are products that are going to be effective for cigarette smokers to get them off cigarettes, and then that we will provide what's needed to get those users off of the e-cigarettes after that. Just to let you know that we at the Institute for Global Tobacco Control does a policy scan of e-cigarette policies around the world. You can find it, just a second, at globaltobaccocontrol.org. We update it twice a year. Sort of the last update was more recent than November 2019. And you can search by the country, by the policy domain, like are they regulating taxes on e-cigarettes? Are they regulating where e-cigarettes can be used in public? Are they regulating the marketing of e-cigarettes? So those are the policy domains. And then different countries classify e-cigarettes as different products, different types of products. So some classify them as tobacco products, some as consumer products, etc. Anyway, so you can search if you're interested in a particular country or just seeing the variation, you can find that. So I think I'm going to end there. Thanks so much for your attention. I see there are questions in the chat, but maybe I'll leave it to Dr. Levin. Are you going to, should I just
Yeah, you can
do the Q&A, or do you want to help with that?
No, you can do them. We can go through them together. I don't know where it ended. I think, Dr. Greenberg, are there any animal studies, given how difficult human studies are? On the other hand, tobacco studies had the same variability.
So around animals, yeah, so there are animal studies for sure. But again, you're going to be looking at one, you don't have the specific device, but you're looking at aerosol, the impacts of aerosol on various, whether it's cardiovascular function, pulmonary function. There's research on, the impact on eyes, all kinds, people work in there, do the research in their specific area. But so you can certainly, that work is certainly being done. And there, in terms of variability, I mean, that's why I was saying, like with cigarettes, we have 70 plus years of research. And as it's not one study that makes a difference. It's the body of literature and the accumulation of studies that points you in the direction of where the truth is, where, we're using different methodologies at different times, at different, so you have enough body of evidence to sort of feel confident in conclusions. And so it's just, as I would say, it's early days right now with the e-cigarettes. People are doing the studies, but more to come, I guess is what I can say.
There's one here, did EVALI worsen COVID outcomes?
Yeah, so basically the EVALI outbreak ended just before COVID hit this country anyway. So they didn't seem, there wasn't really that confluence of factors. So obviously, like there may have been case reports of people who had recovered from EVALI and whether they were more susceptible to coronavirus infection, but I'm not aware of that specifically. But basically by February 2020, there weren't really more emergency department visits for EVALI. And then of course it was sort of around then and later where COVID took off in this country.
And there's a follow-up. Is there a decreasing nicotine e-cigarette?
So e-cigarette, so you can get different strengths of e-cigarettes. Like Juul comes with two different nicotine concentrations. And then people with the more complex devices, what we call open systems, where you can control the power, the airflow, the resistance, all kinds of things. So you can, let's say, use a lower nicotine concentration with a higher power and get the nicotine that you want, but you could also use a higher nicotine concentration liquid with a lower power, which is actually better for you because you're at the lower power, lower temperature, less toxicants. So you actually, that's probably like the better situation. So you can, there is a lot of variability in the nicotine concentration, but for cigarette smokers, what you want is sufficient nicotine concentration. You don't want to give them a nicotine-free e-cigarette. I mean, what that would do is help with the behavioral aspects of smoking. So the habit of having something in your mouth, bringing your hand to your mouth, having something to fidget with, having something to do, you know, all that's sort of important. And I think that's why people think that e-cigarettes would probably have an advantage over things like bupropion or NRT, where you're not having that hand-to-mouth action or something in your hands. With the e-cigarettes, it's something familiar, something to do. But you want enough nicotine concentration so your brain is getting the nicotine that it's craving. Yeah, nicotine gum is good too. So I can just, yeah, nicotine gum is good too. Nicotine gum is really good to help with the like intense cravings. So generally people might use the patch for longer, like to deal with sort of your baseline levels of nicotine. But if you have that craving or a trigger, the gum, it will be good to deal with that, like the shorter term. Sorry, I'll let you go ahead with the questions.
Oh, it's okay. There was just a comment about chain smoking is common in schizophrenia. And then here's one, switching nicotine to an endocannabinoid, so pleasure in vaping without nicotine.
So definitely people are using all kinds of substances in like an e-cigarette device. I mean, so again, from my perspective, the only reason why you want e-cigarettes is to help cigarette smokers get off cigarettes. Okay, so no one else should be using them. So you don't need nicotine for anybody else because you're not trying to replace nicotine in the receptors in the brain. So like you need the nicotine in the e-cigarettes to help cigarette smokers quit cigarettes. You don't need the nicotine for anyone else. And you know, if you want to inhale other kinds of compounds, that's, you know, a whole other topic. There are also people who put vitamin compounds in e-cigarette devices. They use them for like as supplements or for weight loss. You know, you can get like some weight loss drugs in liquid form. So various, like there's all kinds of things that people are doing, as always.
Right. I think I missed a couple earlier as a comment. If anything, e-cigs promote nicotine dependence because of the higher dose hits. Comment there.
Absolutely. And I'll just say, I mean, so that's the thing. People who are promoting e-cigarettes or think that they can be helpful would say that, you know, in the scheme of things, nicotine dependence isn't so bad if you're a cigarette smoker, right? So it's better to be dependent on nicotine than to be smoking cigarettes. Smoking cigarettes is the worst, absolutely worst thing you can do for yourself. Being nicotine dependent, not ideal, but not terrible. I mean, there are cardiovascular effects for sure, but better than cigarette smoking. So, so it's not that nicotine dependence is necessarily bad in and of itself, specifically for cigarette smokers. Like, so NRT, you probably have patients who are using NRT gums, et cetera, long-term for many years. They just need to still have that nicotine. I would say that's absolutely okay. If it prevents them from going back to cigarettes, it is much better. So, so the nicotine dependence for cigarette smokers, I wouldn't worry about that just yet. I would get them off of cigarettes for good and then deal with the nicotine dependence.
There's a comment saying Smoke Enders was a program that addressed the behavioral aspects of smoking. And then we have a question that says, should the devices require a prescription?
Yeah, so let me just start with the behavioral. Behavioral is really, really important. As I said, you know, there's the learned behavior, there's the triggers, there's the social activity, there's the learned behaviors, the coping, all kinds of things. So we can't, you know, you can't fix a whole behavior with just a drug like nicotine. There has to be more than that. And that's why, like, I work in sort of the health policy area. So we try and do other things like reduce the marketing of the products, increase the price, reduce where you can use the product, all kind of change, try and have a supportive environment for not using the product. So the behavioral aspects are really important. And that's why in this trial that was published in New England Journal of Medicine, I pointed out that in addition to the products that people were using, they also had 4 weeks of behavioral support. And we know that that is helpful just to people trying to quit smoking. And then, sorry, the other question was?
Should the device require a prescription?
Prescription. I think that's definitely something to consider. You know, it's challenging because you don't want to put too many barriers. This is the challenge and the balance that society has to make. You don't want to put too many barriers to accessing the product for cigarette smokers, because if it's a lot easier and cheaper and more, you know, to get the cigarettes, why are they going to work harder to get e-cigarettes, something safer? On the other hand, you don't want, you know, youth and non-cigarette smokers to use these products. So prescription might be a way to do it, particularly given that we've made so many mistakes with how we're dealing with e-cigarettes in this country. And that might be the only way to fix where we are now. So definitely something to consider.
Well, thank you very much. I think that we're at the end of the hour. I think by the number of people who stayed on, I think you really enjoyed your topic. It was great to have your health policy perspective in our grand rounds. So really appreciate you coming up and spending some time with us. So thanks, Dr. Cohen.
Thanks, Dr. Thomas. If anyone has any other questions, just email me.
Great. Thank you very much. Have a good day, everybody. Enjoy. See you all.